The criminal case involving the death of Freddie Gray has many different legal issues, and there is already widespread misinformation being distributed. So hopefully this video clears up some of those misconceptions. First, it is important to note that the officers in this case have been charged by criminal information. A criminal information is not a finding of guilt. It's not the end of the criminal process. In fact, this is just the beginning of the criminal process. From here, the government could choose to proceed in one of two ways. First, the government could proceed through what's called a grand jury. A grand jury is a secret proceeding that is held with members of the public, where the prosecutor is allowed to present evidence to those members of the public, and those members of the public decide whether there's probable cause to move forward with the criminal charges. If the members of the public decide that there is probable cause to move forward, then they return what is called an indictment. However, there is another way this case could proceed, and that's called a preliminary hearing. So instead of presenting evidence to a grand jury, the state could decide to present evidence to a judge, and that hearing would be public. And if the judge decided that there was probable cause to move forward after the preliminary hearing, then the case would move forward. However, if the judge decided that there was no probable cause, then the case against the police officers would stop right there. Well, this case involves charges of second-degree murder, manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, vehicular manslaughter, second-degree assault, and false imprisonment. Second-degree murder is a very serious charge here in Maryland. It carries a maximum penalty of 30 years in prison. And what's notable about second-degree murder is that it does not require an intent to kill. In Maryland, there are at least 4 different ways for a prosecutor to prove second-degree murder, one of which is called depraved heart murder. For depraved heart murder, the prosecutor need only prove that the defendant committed a reckless act and that this reckless act had a conscious disregard for human life. Manslaughter here in Maryland carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. There are several different ways for the government to prove manslaughter, one of which is voluntary manslaughter. Voluntary manslaughter is the intentional killing done in the heat of passion before the person had a significant amount of time to cool off. Involuntary manslaughter is an unintentional killing where there's a causal connection to the person's death. One way to prove involuntary manslaughter is where the defendant had a legal duty to act, but failed to act, and that failure to act is connected to someone's death. Vehicular manslaughter. If the prosecutor can prove that a person operated a motor vehicle in a grossly negligent manner and as a result caused the death of another, then the prosecutor has proved vehicular manslaughter. Second-degree assault is a serious charge here in Maryland. Second-degree assault carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison. There are several different ways that a prosecutor could prove second-degree assault, one of which is if a defendant offensively touches another person. If the prosecutor can prove that there was contact between the defendant and another person, and that contact was offensive, the prosecutor has proved second-degree assault. There is another way to prove second-degree assault, and that is an attempt to commit an offensive touching. In other words, if the prosecutor can prove that a defendant attempted or tried to offensively contact another person, then the prosecutor has proved second-degree assault. There's another way for a prosecutor to prove second-degree assault, and that is if a defendant intends to frighten another person. And if the prosecutor can prove that a defendant intended to frighten someone else, with the threat of violence, then the prosecutor has proved second-degree assault. False imprisonment is also a very serious charge here in Maryland. And for a prosecutor to prove the crime of false imprisonment, the prosecutor need only prove that the defendant unlawfully detained another person against that other person's will. And if the prosecutor can prove such, the prosecutor can request a sentence of up to 10 years imprisonment